All right. Well, it's 5:32. I think we can begin, if nobody has any objection. I am Ryan Marzeidler. I am a member of the steering committee of the New Hampshire Network for Environment, Energy, and Climate. Welcome, everybody, to the last of our series of webinars for this season before we all disperse for the summer. We have a very interesting and somewhat complicated set of topics to go over tonight. The United States Forest Service is undergoing the most significant structural change in its history, the stated aim of which is to bring the agency closer to its customers, to eliminate layers of bureaucracy, and to consolidate redundant functions. Those are all quotations. These structural changes to the service include eliminating the current 9 regional offices and replacing them with 15 state directors, each responsible for coordinating forest operations, partnerships, and intergovernmental relationships. Among other things, the national leadership will move from Washington, D.C. to Salt Lake City, Utah, to be closer to Western landscapes. That would involve relocating about 2,600 Capital Region staff to 5 regional hubs, many of whom Secretary of Agriculture Brooke Rollins has acknowledged might decline the move. That's a problem. It's a potential problem. 2026 USFS Forest Service budget anticipates cutting staff by an additional 26% on top of that. And more than 5,000 employees have already been eliminated through firings, buyouts, and early retirements. Importantly, a large number of forest research facilities are slated to be closed down, including at least one in New Hampshire, namely the Bartlett Experimental Forest in the White Mountains town of Bartlett. And we're going to hear a lot more about Bartlett Forest this evening. For historical as well as geographical reasons, New England has often felt that the Forest Service didn't pay enough close attention to the specifics of northeastern forests, despite the fact that New England actually contains several of the most heavily forested states in the country. So, question is, what kind of regional impact will the process of moving Forest Service central offices out west, away from DC, what kind of impact will that have? Where currently in DC, they have access to legislators, key agency partners, and so forth. Out west, it'll be harder to interact with other agencies. And that's just one of the big questions we're going to look at today. Even though a supposedly final framework for these changes was published on March 31st of this year, it seems like a lot of the specifics are still under discussion and negotiation. So with this caveat in mind, we were very fortunate to persuade 3 regional experts to join with us tonight and to give some of their perspectives on the proposed changes. I'll introduce each of our guest speakers briefly first, then they'll each give a short presentation, and we'll leave time for questions at the end. So audience members, dear audience members, please put your questions into the chat as we go along. My colleagues Susan Richmond and John Gage will kindly help to field them. Now, to introduce our speakers, Joe Short is Vice President of the Northern Forest Center, based in Concord, New Hampshire. As leader of the center's forest economy and regional strategies program areas, he has led numerous regional initiatives, including the Sustainable Economy Initiative, the Future Forest Economy Initiative, and currently the Coalition of Northern Forest Innovation and Research, CONFOR. CONFOR is a strategic regional partnership across New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont to advance precision forest management and sustainable forest production. Collectively, the Northern Forest Center's efforts have secured and guided tens of millions of dollars of investment in rural economic development throughout the Northern Forest region. So Joe's perspective is firmly regional on the ecosystems that make up the Northern Forest and the communities that live there. Secondly, Dr. David King, studies wildlife ecology and conservation, particularly in relation to habitat management. His long-term specialty has been neotropical migrant songbirds, but he also works with mammals, snakes, native bees, and paleotropical migrants. His research includes the study of the ways forest birds respond to different forestry systems for extracting timber primarily, the way they respond to forest roads, the way they respond to urban development, the abundance and nesting success of shrubland birds in relation to forest management, the habitat selection and survival of birds during the post-fledging period, and the effects of climate change and other anthropogenic stressors on bird populations. So Dave has worked at and directed research as lead scientist at Bartlett Experimental Forest, and now teaches in the Department of Environmental Conservation at UMass Amherst. Welcome, David King. And finally, Mariko Yamasaki is a longtime field biologist and researcher who's worked on many aspects of northern forest ecology, from small mammals to breeding birds, salamanders, red oak regeneration, from bats to the impacts of different forestry operations on the ecology of northern forest types. As an employee of the U.S. Forest Service until 2023, she worked for many years at Bartlett Experimental Forest, BEF, as well as at many other forest sites around New England and throughout the Northeast. Mariko has authored multiple articles and reports on the outcomes of her research, as well as several comprehensive histories of research at Bartlett Forest, and also has produced the U.S. Forest Service official technical guidelines to wildlife management for landowners throughout the northern woodlands. So together, Joe, Dave, and Mariko represent many decades of Forest Service institutional knowledge on northern forest ecology. Their work exemplifies the long-term, place-based forest research model that is indispensable for healthy forest management. So, Joe, let's start with you. What's being contemplated here, and what kinds of impacts do you expect on the northern forest region? You can go ahead and share your slides.
All right. Thank you, Reinmar. And hello, everyone. Thanks for being here and for your interest in this topic. So Reinmar introduced me. I'm Joe Short. I'm vice president with the Northern Forest Center, and I'll just give a really quick thumbnail on my organization so you understand the context I'm looking at this issue from. And then I will share a little bit of a primer of sorts on the Forest Service and how it's structured to set up why this proposed reorganization matters in our state, and what my organization and many, many others are trying to do about it. The center is a regional innovation and investment organization. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. Our focus is on rural vibrancy, and our work is grounded in people, economy, and the forest landscape together. This is the region. When I say Northern Forest, this is the region I'm referring to, and as the context for my work, 30 million acres plus or minus across 4 states, the rooftop of northern New England and upstate New York. Historically, after colonialization, a forest-dependent, pulp and paper-dependent region, home to over 2 million people, and a region that is really characterized by its forests. This is the highest level representation of the Northern Forest Center's strategic plan, showing our emphasis on strengthening rural communities, growing forest-based businesses, and deepening forest stewardship. Ideally, all of the work, the programs we run, sit at the center of that. And I show this to you because it certainly informs how I think about the Forest Service, its role in our region, and the impact of these changes. Thinking about business impacts as well as community impacts and impacts on the forest. And there's our website if anyone is curious and wants to learn more. But more to the topic at hand. So Reinmar gave a really nice summary of this. So this is a lot of this is repetition, but why are we talking about this? As he noted back in March, the USDA secretary announced this Forest Service reorganization plan, which the administration had teased some months prior. There's a lot in it, and it's not just for the Forest Service. These reorganizations, they span all of USDA, but the ones relevant to the Forest Service are closure of a significant number of the agency's research facilities around the country, that relocation of the headquarters, total revamping of the regional structure, which has been in place for many, many, many years, consolidating that and putting what appear to be politically appointed state directors at their head in lieu of career Forest Service officials, which is the current model. Separately, and this is really important to note, in both its fiscal 26 and fiscal 27 budget requests, the administration has proposed elimination of multiple U.S. Forest Service programs. So basically taking their funding from hundreds of millions down to zero. I'll come back to this, but the point is there is more to this story than simply the reorganization happening as we look at, what worst case is in many ways I think can be described as a dismantlement, potential dismantlement of this agency. So I think it's important to understand a little bit about the Forest Service to set up this conversation and some of its major divisions. Most of us, and I would argue the lay public, if they know about the Forest Service at all, what do they think about? They think about probably our national forest lands, the national forest system, 193 acres across the country. We, of course, have our own White Mountain National Forest close to home, Green Mountains, and many others. Yes, there are more national forest lands in the West, but we have a lot here in the East. The National Forest System Division is also where fire suppression lives. And as I'm sure most of us know, that has been a massive area of focus for the agency and for Congress in recent decades. Another division, and really relevant, frankly, the focus of today's conversation is the research division, which in a variety of ways provides data and science to inform policy and management decisions on all forests in our country, not just the national forests, private forests. There are research stations in Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands as well, so all forests in our country. And then third division, one called state, private, and tribal forestry, which many folks may have never heard of, but is really important, as you might gather from the name. In our part of the country, most of the forests are privately owned. So this is the division of the Forest Service that assists private landowners, state agencies like our Division of Forest and Lands, tribes, and urban and community forest interests in understanding and managing their forests. So it's really important, again, just to know and be able to articulate, I think, that the Forest Service is about a lot more than the national forests. Those are key, but they can't be the only part of the conversation. So a little bit more about how these programs actually touch down here in the ground or on the ground in New Hampshire. First, and I'm going to follow those three divisions. So the National Forest System, we of course have the White Mountain National Forest, actually birthplace. The Weeks Act was the birthplace of the idea of the National Forest System. And that's our touch point to the National Forest System here in our state. In the research division, and this is primarily what we're talking about today, we have two experimental forests that exist within the White Mountain National Forest, the Hubbard Brook and Bartlett Experimental Forests. And Dave and Mariko are going to speak to those. There is also a really important bit of information that is produced by the Forest Service called the Forest Inventory and Analysis, or FIA. I've heard this described as like a tree census for the country, but this is a really critical data set that any of us who do anything with forests use to understand forests in the US. These are longitudinal data sets, cover the entire country, and are really important for ecology, for economy, really all uses in terms of understanding what is growing and projected to grow on the landscape. It's really a critical and frankly irreplaceable source of information. The last division and everything else that's going to populate this screen in a sec lives under state, private, and tribal forestry. And I want to emphasize that here in New Hampshire, we are around 83% forested, one of the most forested states in the country. As Reinmar said, 72% of those forests are privately owned. So services to private forest landowners are really important. I would also note that 13% of the budget for New Hampshire's Division of Forest and Lands comes from the Forest Service through these programs. So it's not just the Forest Service delivering these programs for private landowners, it's our state agency deploying federal resources. And I'm guessing we all know that in New Hampshire, 13% of your budget is no joke, and the state is not going to come up with that very easily if those resources go away. So just to give you a flavor for some of those programs, there are a variety of forest health programs that help landowners detect, monitor, and protect forests from things like spruce budworm, emerald ash borer, now beech leaf disease. Really important services for keeping our forest healthy. There are stewardship programs that assist private landowners in managing their forests for lots of different purposes: wildlife habitat, climate resilience, water quality, wood products, and other things. The urban and community forest programs plant trees in cities and support communities in taking ownership of creating community-owned forests, and there are a number of these in New Hampshire. And lastly, while we may think, well, forest fire is not a big deal here in New Hampshire, increasingly it's a concern. These programs are what help our state agencies think about their capacity for fire prevention, control, and suppression. So, as you look at this slide, we are primarily talking today about the Hubbard Brook and Bartlett experimental forests, but I want to put that conversation in this broader context of all the things that the Forest Service provides here in New Hampshire and across the Northern Forest and nationally, and note that all of this is at risk, not just the experimental forests. So, what has been the response? We're going to loop back to this at the end, but I think really notably, these changes and the proposed zeroing out a number of Forest Service budgets have galvanized a pretty diverse coalition of conservation industry and other interests. Society of Protection of New Hampshire Forests, Appalachian Mountain Club, Nature Conservancy, Audubon, New Hampshire Timberland Owners, Northern Forest Center, and others. I know there are representatives from some of these groups on the screen. We've all been really active in raising our voices and helping our constituents understand these issues. Those have supported, in part, a bit of good news. Secretary Rollins gave an assurance to Senator Jeanne Shaheen and to Governor Kelly Ayotte that Hubbard Brook, which was a bit of a question mark as to how that would be impacted, would not be closed. But as Reinmar said, a lot of the other details are still in development, and Bartlett remains a big question mark. And just recently, Representatives Pappas and Goodlander, I think I saw someone from Representative Goodlander's team on the call, have introduced the Protecting America's Forest Act, which would require Congress to approve changes like these before the administration could act. But the takeaway, as Reinmar said, is this is very much still in process. It's great that this conversation is happening. We'll come back to the advocacy opportunities at the end. But I hope that set a good stage for Dave and Mariko to now dive into the really important and I think pretty compelling specifics of what research on Forest Service experimental forests looks like. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joe Short. Awesome introduction. And I think we can jump straight to Mariko, who's going to share her slides. and get into some of the detail here about Bartlett experimental forest and the importance of the kind of work that's done there.
Okie doke. Thank you, Reinmar. Thank you, Joe. What I'm going to do is try and give you a real brief overview of what's been happening at Bartlett, things that you may or may not be aware of, and what the relative values have been and hopefully will continue to be. Let's go. All right, so Bartlett was initiated out of lands from the White Mountain National Forest in 1931 and officially established in 32. But the fellows here in the top right initiated that work. The fellows in the left side of the slide are some of the big names in forestry over the last 50 years, and pay particular attention to the fellow with the binocular case on his shoulder and the fellow with the red flagging in that color photo. That is Bill Leake. Bill Leake was a silviculture researcher at Bartlett on northern hardwoods for the last 68 years. He worked for Forest Service, and most of those years were in New Hampshire at Bartlett. And so it's really, really important to understand there's a lot of history here. Bartlett very much is a managed forest. It's embedded in the White Mountain National Forest. There are managed compartments. There are compartments that were cut in the late 1880s, and there are and have not been treated since. And there are compartments at Bartlett that have never really seen any forest practices and are in reserve areas. So it was established in 1932 on 2,600 acres in the town of Bartlett. The lower part of the forest was cut fairly hard to feed the railroad trains that moved up the tracks that now are the Bare Notch Road to remove wood at higher elevations. So initially, Bartlett was set up to serve as the Northern Hardwoods research location. Each experimental forest that had a silviculture focus was focused on different forest types. So what used to be Gale River was spruce fir. The Penobscot over in Maine was spruce fir and other things. So this is the past history. Today, in 2005, the White Mountain National Forest added another 3,200 acres to the existing Bartlett footprint. And you can see the compartments. So the Bartlett now occupies pretty much the drainage, the watershed of Bartlett, the Louisville and Albany brooks that take care of a lot of the public water supply for the western side of the town of Bartlett. But what you're looking at is the original footprint. The blue numbers are compartments that were part of the expansion area that we intend to keep working on, and the upper elevations right up to the height of land is in a reserve area. So it provides an integrated silviculture and wildlife habitat research across a set of management conditions for a broad array of environmental research. These are all managed landscapes. You can see high lands. You can see cutting up to some of those areas, and it's a beautiful place. Silviculture research thinks about a couple of things. It thinks about the kinds of treatments that regenerate, the kinds and quality of regeneration, species composition that is desired. It also thinks very hard about volumes, and it thinks very much about quality. You do not want to be growing a lot of crooked, holy trees, because the value is not going to be there. So different treatments, size of opening influences composition, and you have two ways of looking at this with respect to hardwoods and softwoods. You can think about complete clear cuts or wildlife clear cuts. We think about open shelterwoods and closed shelterwoods where there's a residual canopy left for a while. There is also single tree selection and group selection, which are considered uneven age treatments that try to maintain a more complete canopy across the landscapes. So the frequency of cutting matters. It's important to ephemeral habitats like early successional habitat, and the spatial and temporal patterns influence that reoccupation of those conditions. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of some of the things that Bartlett has worked on very hard. And one of them is single tree selection on granitic soils in New England. The early studies at Bartlett focused on single tree selection. Beech regeneration on granitic soils thrives with a fairly complete overstory. And so you will get a tremendous composition of beech in the understory. That, coupled with what's happening with the advancing front of beech leaf disease, leaves a big question on what's going to happen from here on in with respect to that. So valuable species are not being necessarily regenerated very well through this technique. What was initiated as initially initiated as a example of poor practice became something very, very different over time. In compartment 22, in the top left box, you can see a 20-acre clear cut where everything was removed between 1933 and 1934. It was that era's version of whole tree harvesting. You can see how it has regenerated in the 70s. The borders of it are still slightly visible, but by 2010, you cannot see the boundaries of that anymore. So that first study was conducted, cut in 1933 and 34, and it's been followed ever since. You can see the sapling and small pole stand in the 1960s, and in 2008, small saw timber. There's been one commercial thinning in there in the meantime, and what we have today there is a very well-stocked multi-species stands. The stems are straight, they're not bushes, and this is what you want to be doing. Another piece of this puzzle is sugar maple regeneration is tough to get on granitic soils. There was research conducted by Complex Systems and the Northern Research Station back at the turn of the century, the 2000s. Aerial imagery, hyperspectral imagery, flown at a couple of different scales, was able to create a map that images primary productivity and the nitrogen content of the canopy in that colored map. The red spots are the highest nitrogen primary productivity areas on the forest that just so happen to be places of active management. It's a really, really important piece of the understanding because people didn't understand what was going on when the results of that those average flights were gotten. One of the things that's interesting, though, is because of the extraordinarily nitrogen-rich and nutrient-rich leaf composition that larger clear cuts create, there's a much richer leaf litter that's put on the ground. And on these granitic soils, this is where you begin to get sugar maple regeneration. And Bill, in his wisdom over the years, looked at a lot of the older stands with group selection and old clear cuts and found a much higher proportion of sugar maple in the regenerated stand than you would ever find in single tree selection. That is a tremendous piece of understanding for managers on dealing with granitic soils. I'm going to turn this to Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Mariko. Yeah, so I guess it's got to be obvious by now how key it is to have information on our forests that support, of course, this huge timber industry, recreational industry, our watersheds, our climate, and everything. And really, the Bartlett Experimental Forest is really the place that's given birth to the kind of silviculture that's necessary to sustain those long-term under potentially varying conditions. But also an important part of this is wildlife research. And I'm a bird researcher, but of course, there are other forms of other organisms that are studied on the Bartlett Experimental Forest. And a really great thing about the Bartlett Experimental Forest is it is a really great, there's just so many things about the facility that facilitate research. I think an important thing is you really have exemplars of the best kind of silviculture on the forest. And so, in terms of the entire eastern forest, so that you have an opportunity to sample organisms across different systems representing different forms of silviculture to get an idea of what those sort of practices will do, what their impacts will be on wildlife. And of course, this is key because, lawsuits regularly bring these kind of management practices to a dead halt. And with the kind of information, comprehensive, detailed information that's generated at a place like Bartlett, the managers are able to more thoroughly incorporate these practices or this information into their planning, and it's more robust. They're basically the practices themselves, but they're also more defensible because they can show that there's a long-term interdisciplinary information that's underpinning those practices that they're proposing. Long-term information is also really key because, of course, organisms, populations vary over time, and really understanding their long-term changes are key. And the great thing about the Bartlett Experimental Forest and the researchers there is that they are relieved to some extent, at least the federal employees, from like the short-term grant-driven sort of research programs that can't really capture necessarily these long-term patterns. Access to facilities is key. Bartlett has not only all these forest stands with known histories going back, close to a century, but there's also a road network to access these sites. And there's dormitory accommodations with and laboratory space. And those things are all key, both to Forest Service researchers, but also our collaborators that are generating all this important information that are necessary to comprehensively manage our forests. And so without access to these facilities, we've actually seen this during this season when folks haven't had access to Bartlett. It's really been a real challenge for these folks and to continue their research on the Bartlett Experimental Forest. And so you can see that this information is not going to be as accessible comprehensive or useful to society. And then, of course, there's control over treatments too. Like a lot of the White Mountain National Forest is a given stand is subject to a lot of different potential considerations when managers are thinking about performing some kind of management there. Whereas on the Bartlett Experimental Forest, it's just the research, so that you don't have to worry about a research plot that you have being subject to some kind of manipulation, like it might be on the Greater White Mountain National Forest, where they have other multiple uses that they need to respond to. So the control over treatments is another really key thing. And all these things have really been responsible for the Bartlett Experimental Forest really generating some top-notch information on all these organisms pictured here and more. Are you going to take this one, Mariko? Because this is more of a silvicultural.
If you want. So one of the other examples I wanted to show folks was the relevance of group selection that allows foresters and managers to think about getting the kind of desired regeneration, as well as accommodating and providing some early successional bird habitat. So what group selection does is it's an uneven age practice that takes periodically a proportion of the stand and regenerates it. Usually you focus on the mature trees that oftentimes are clumped up together. It's a flexible treatment system in that you can look at group sizes that are a tenth to 2 acres in size, and it's very much based on the long-term work that was started back in 1937 and has been kept up by Bill right up to his retirement in 2022.
Right. And so a key aspect of this, of course, is understanding what the impacts of these various practices are on wildlife and other values. And with respect to birds, the Bartlett Experimental Forest was the site of a really influential study done by Chris Costello and company. And so what it basically indicated is that this is an ordination. The key thing to know is that these different colors represent different treatments. And those those red spots are like right out in clear cuts, whereas these blue shades are mature forest, and in the middle are kind of group selection cuts. And so a lot of researchers were suspicious of group selection cuts for maintaining shrubland birds, because a lot of bird species, like mature forest bird species, are area sensitive. They can't use small patches, and when they do, their reproductive success is lower. So the thought was that although group selection definitely provides a lot of silvicultural advantages, it might actually provide the open sort of extensive kind of habitat that some of these shrubland birds need, like chestnut-sided warblers. And these other successional shrubland birds are actually the ones that are declining most rapidly in our forest systems because of the lack of changing kinds of management and the lack of natural disturbances. The forest is just too young. If it were an old-growth forest, you'd have gaps that form naturally. But in these secondary forests, you don't really get a lot of natural gaps. It really takes management to get these birds in there. So this is a key finding, one of many key findings. This study's been cited hundreds of times, really showing that it's become part of the intellectual infrastructure that really underpins a whole bunch of this stuff. Because if you have peer-reviewed information, it's really important because it's gone through a rigorous process to evaluate it. And so that managers are able to put more credence in it, and that people who are reading management documents or interacting with managers know that those managers really have done their homework in terms of selecting information that's robust. And so here, this is an example of work that is really extremely influential in terms of how we understand the effects of management on wildlife and birds.
So based upon that work, we decided that the lower part of the forest, which had been pretty much cut off in the late 1880s, We wanted to regenerate some of the earlier successional shade intolerant tree species, and we wanted to package them up so that they weren't so difficult to find, because a lot of the bird research is that with banded birds are showing that birds born at their natal site will return to those sites, and if there's no additional habitat, acceptable habitat, they have to expend a lot more energy to find comparable places. Bartlett's 0 to 10 age class runs probably in the 1 to 2% of the 5,800 acres in 0 to 10 years old. That is a very, very low number. So what we did was we created some early successional habitat for birds and intolerant tree species, and we created opportunities to examine prescribed fire treatments as a part of that exercise. Now, on the lower right, is results from the 85-year documented record of how trees are growing on the experimental forest. And the biggest warning signs of compositional change has been the continued loss of early successional shade intolerant tree species, aspen and paper birch. And aspen and paper birch are pretty easy to regenerate, but you have to give them some space. You've got to let the sun hit the ground. So the blue lines are aspen, the green lines are paper birch, and you're looking at 3 elevational gradients from lower elevation at the bottom to the higher elevation plots across Bartlett. And what it shows is a dramatic decrease. And you have to remember, it's the lower part of the forest, the lower elevation part of the forest, that was most heavily cut off in the late 1880s. So that's where the aspen was. And we're trying to get more back. So as they say, integrated research. Go, Dave.
Yeah. So a real revelation was that during the period in which birds are making a transition from leaving the nest to being prepared to migrate, it's about a 2-month period that then starts about in mid-August in the Bartlett experimental forest, that these birds are really making dramatic transitions into, oh, actually, I got the wrong slide here. Sorry. Yeah, what this slide depicts is basically how you're not getting the same birds in clear cuts as you are in patches or in shelterwoods. If you look at that, again, we're really excited about the early successional birds because those birds are declining. They're dependent on management, at least until we can get a decent amount of old growth around that naturally generates gaps. But again, secondary forests don't naturally generate gaps that are big enough for shrub and birds to use. So you can see all this light green when you're looking at these clear-cut observations. So those really are showing that those shrub and birds are most abundant, most present. Really, they're most abundant, and also there's more species in these clear-cut areas than either the shelterwood or either the patch or the shelterwood treatments. And again, there's certainly, reasons for using patches or shelterwoods based on silviculture or other values. But if you're looking for shrub and birds, keep in mind that in places where you have consistency between your silvicultural goals and even age management like clear cuts, you'll get more bang for your buck in terms of these declining early successional birds with these clear cut even age management treatments than you would with some of these other forms of partial cuts, as I call them, because I don't know anything about silviculture.
We can talk about post-fledging.
Right. So this is a key revelation. So We're talking about how we have shrub and birds, these early successional birds, and you have these mature forest birds. It turns out that during that period when the young are becoming independent from the adults, after they leave the nest and making the shift to independence and then getting ready to migrate, that they do this huge habitat shift. And so you got is these mature forest birds in clear cuts is the light green, forest is the dark green. And these are like forest birds. You got Swainson thrush, hermit thrush, blue-headed vireo, red-eyed vireo, ovenbird, black-birding warbler, black-throated blue warbler, black-throated green warbler, myrtle warbler. These are all birds that nest in mature forests, but their numbers are out of this. They're actually more abundant in these regenerating clear cuts during this post-fledging period that starts in about mid-July, July through August. And so it just is another example of the importance of maintaining that early successional habitat. Not only does it maintain this important component of the bird community of the northern forest, that is to say the shrub and birds, but also during this post-fledging period, it looks like it's really important for supporting these mature forest birds. They nest in mature forests, but for some of these species, like there's hardly any individuals in the mature forest during the post-fledging period. Late July, August, they all move into these clear cuts. Their young are secure because the stem density, hawks can't get at them. There's lots of insects, there's lots of fruit, blackberries and stuff. So again, this is a revelation and work by the Northern Research Station, including work on the Bartlett Experimental Forest, was key in terms of developing this concept that's really influenced the way that we look at mature forest birds and what kind of management is beneficial to them.
Thanks, Dave. All right. This is just a couple of slides to look at some prescribed fire. On the prior slides that I showed you, looking at trying to reduce the amount of residual material left on the site. Chris was walking across much of those areas 2, 3, and 4 feet off the ground. So we were concerned about seedling regeneration. So in 2021, we initiated several fire treatments, prescribed fire treatments with appropriate controls. We set that up. We were able to work with White Mountain National Forest Fire Team as well as the Jackson and Bartlett fire departments. Got a really good training exercise out of it. We burned a number of acres and did some pre-burn measurements and post-burn measurements. And bottom line, what we did after the post treatment measurements, duff, slash, and seedlings dominate the coverage pre-treatment, but herb, duff, slash, and seedlings dominate the post-treatment plots. We probably put in, I think, 1,400 very small plots to check on what the composition of what the coverage of burning was across those areas, and how much of the slash layer had been reduced. And we probably cut the slash layer almost in half. So it was a good field exercise and experiment, and I just hope that somebody will keep it going. So what this sort of entails begins to give you an idea that the species habitat relationships at Bartlett, there are going to be some species that you would expect to see in unmanaged stands or stands that had some pretty contiguous overstory cover, like redback salamanders, like red-breasted nuthatches, like northern flying squirrels. But the early successional birds, of which chestnut-sideds, common yellowthroats, mourning warblers, things like that, are found where there's habitat. It's in those very ephemeral cuts that are 3 to 15 years old. And what we're looking at here is balancing options and habitat conditions and opportunities to give managers ideas. Now, the thing with group selection is group selection can be applied on large industrial acreages. It can be applied on private forest lands where the ownership acreage is much smaller. It's a treatment that can be very flexible depending upon what the landowner's objectives are. But what we do know about vertebrate richness at Bartlett on those granitic soils that have really no wetland component, not a whole lot of water coming down through it. We have a very, very rich vertebrate diversity across the landscape. We've got all the small mammals with the exception of the northern bog lemmings showing up in our sampling areas at Bartlett. We've got a number of different frog species, salamander species, a good array of forest raptors, and a full complement of primary cavity nesters. So this makes for a very interesting place to be. Our cooperators, Bartlett provides a protected, managed forest landscape upon which cooperative, basic, and applied research can be conducted. The Roe Lab out of the University of New Hampshire has conducted small mammal population investigations and community dynamics for probably close to 15 years now at Bartlett. And some of the publications are highlighted there. Rachel Winfrey's lab at Rutgers is investigating currently forest pollinators and new clear cuts and shelterwoods and older mature hardwood stands across New England, and we were instrumental in helping her lab get plots and get cooperation with our friends and neighbors across New England. So she had a chance to find the kinds of places she was looking for. Mark Ducey's lab, silviculture lab at UNH, takes care of the cruise plot data from which that aspen and paper birch information came from. He tends all those plots. They've been marked magnetically on their key points. The long-term vegetative record has been put into Forest Service archives, which is publicly available, and he's stewarding a second growth density study now. Neon that is run out of the National Science Foundation and the cooperators Battelle Ecology has a 130-foot tower in the lower slope position at Bartlett that has been doing a lot of open source investigations that are publicly available. So anybody can go to the Neon Battelle website, look for Bartlett, and download available information on phenology, on all sorts of air chemistry, soil information, vegetation information on the plots that they're keeping track of. That's a really important piece. Ameriflux has a tower at Bartlett as well, looking at eddy covariance. And Ruth Ann I's lab out of SUNY has a longstanding nutrient study going on. So these are just some of the examples of what is going on and continues to go on at Bartlett. But one of the things that's really, really important that doesn't hit the highlights often is the number of international requests for visits, the number of National Forest training events that we have. UNH sends their capstone wildlife class to Bartlett every winter for probably 30 plus years now to give them an experience of what does integrated management look like. And it's really, really important. On top of that, we've had more than a couple of Forest Service chiefs come to Bartlett to see what collaborative management and shared stewardship management looks like. We've also had the Silviculture Institute for Northern Hardwoods use Bartlett in 2017, 18, and last year, 2025. Couple day event. People are interested and they ask really good questions. So to wrap things up, the experimental forests today stand on the dedicated shoulders of those who have come before us. Bill Leake, Chris Costello, Chaley Hoover is still working in Durham. John Janelle was our firebug, and the level of dedication to the mission of the experimental forest, you couldn't ask for any better representation of folks doing that work. So what has Bartlett's taught us about silviculture, habitat, and timber harvesting in the Northeast so far? Variety is extraordinarily important. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Land ownership size can influence the size of openings. There's no one size of opening that you would ever want to demand landowners use. Working forest landscapes can produce a variety of quality products, whether it's wood, habitat, recreational opportunities, visually appealing landscapes, over time with good planning and implementation. And it is extraordinarily important to keep an open mind. So finally, we get to the crux of the issue. Does NRS continue this long-term applied research management work, knowing that the silviculture expertise vacated the scene in the end of 2022, and I retired in 23. Here are some facts. Institutional memory fades without a replacement to pass that knowledge on to. Electronic archives are limited in what can be passed on locally. It doesn't do it all. You've got to have that nose-to-nose conversation and relationships. Collaborative relationships fade away with time and with nobody to continue the long-term applied research. You need staffing that can manage the lands on the experimental forest to meet those objectives. Continuing to treat experimental forest stands for future study is a question if you walk away from the experimental forest. And as we have demonstrated, both applied and basic research are capable of being done on this forest and are certainly needed in the Northeast. So that's a slide that I've given Reinmar. These are contacts in the first box. If you're interested in sharing your viewpoint with these people, I would suggest strongly to do it far sooner than later. And from Hubbard Brook is a bullet on who's on the appropriations committees, and particularly people that need to hear from folks that are interested in experimental forests. So I'm done. I want to say thank you to everybody for listening. I'm stopping my sharing now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariko Yamasaki and David King. This was awesome. I think the interactive format was great because to me it shows very clearly that there's no real distinction between research on management and research on wildlife because all of our forests, especially in the East, but everywhere in the world, are now affected in different ways by human activities. So we need to be studying what kind of impacts those have in as much detail as we can on wildlife, as well as what kind of effects the human activities, including silviculture, have on forest productivity. In other words, they're not really separated things, and that's the importance of a facility like Bartlett and other research forests, because they have the capacity to do that and to look back in time at early data sets and make comparisons with what's going on right now and make projections into the future about what's going on because everything's changing all the time faster than ever now. So we need this research desperately in order to really be able to manage our forests, in a scientific, consistent way into the future. So it's quite scary, I think. I mean, I'm editorializing now, but it's scary to think that this kind of research may be much harder to carry out in the future if this reorganization goes forward as is being threatened. Now, please, audience, put your questions, comments into the chat. There, I see a bunch of questions. Most of them have come from me so far. But let me start out with asking a couple of things that I wrote in. The first thing was as David was talking about his research on birds, I was thinking back to what these forests would have been like before colonial impacts. And would some of the species that you've been working with, David, in shrublands and early successional forests, secondary forests, would they have simply been very rare species that might have been only in existence in small areas affected by small fires, or how do you see that? Go ahead, David.
Well, I mean, there's information on old growth forests, right? Like this guy, his name was Runkle, Jim maybe, and he was at University in Ohio, and he went to old growth forests all through the eastern U.S. and he mapped out openings, gaps, natural gaps, because you have old trees, they get to be hundreds of years old. When they fall over, they make a big gap. And so he found that about 30% of the forest, the old growth forests, were in gaps. And of those, about 10 or 15% were big enough for shrub and birds. So those shrub and birds would have been all through these stands, really. And then not only do you have gaps, but you also got situations where they have blowdown, so it might also be suitable. I think a big problem now is that we have a type of forest that, although it's subject to a lot of pests because it's homogeneous in terms of species, in terms of age class, it's susceptible in that respect. It's not susceptible to the type of disturbance like an old growth forest would have experienced, when you had 300-year-old trees with giant crowns coming down. And so, yeah, I think that these birds are now as scarce as they've ever been, actually, in the Northeast. So I think we're looking at a few percent of the landscape is in shrubland habitat in our region.
Right. Well, thank you.
That you get that kind of information out of the FIA summaries. If you go through the numbers and the tools that FIA provides, you come up with some very, very low percentages of regenerating gaps across New England.
Yeah. I'm wondering, maybe Joe could say something about this. That we didn't mention the roadless rule, but part of the or one of the components of this proposed reorganization is that the roadless rule would be rescinded. Joe, what kind of an impact would that have in the Northeast? I mean, I know that's a big issue out west. What about the northeastern forests? How would they be affected?
So I will start by saying I'm by no means a deep expert on this topic. I mean, the roadless rule is relevant to national forest lands, so it would have impacts specifically here in New Hampshire on the White Mountain National Forest. I believe, and others on the screen may know, I think there are 300 some thousand acres of roadless areas on the White Mountain. Which is significant. I mean, my organization is on. We submitted comment in opposition to this. Fundamentally, don't think there is anything. Uh, well, I would say the notion of production from our national forests is not an issue. It's not something my organization takes issue with. But it is really important to maintain public trust in how forest lands are managed. And the roadless rule and NEPA National Environmental Protection Act are two really important ways that we do that. Roads demonstrably, actually, and kind of this is a little bit counterintuitive, but actually increase fire likelihood. And they also are vectors for putting more invasives on the landscape, which invasives they're a problem, I think, probably everywhere, but they're particularly a problem here in the Northeast, given our proximity to lots of ports, and we're a bit of an epicenter for invasive pests and pathogens. So fundamentally, probably not a good outcome. I would say, however, that, and this is my personal opinion, I am more concerned about these large scale, the large scale, again, potential dismantlement of the Forest Service. Frankly, doesn't it matters less what rules are or aren't in place if there is no agency in place to enforce them.
Mhm.
And as we've seen, in this call, if there's not good science happening to understand the impacts of whatever management policies are in place at the time, that's really damaging. So these are all concerns, but I think we probably all appreciate we're operating in a time of many, many, many concerns. And personally, I elevate the survival of the Forest Service and the protection of its awesome dedicated employees and that institutional knowledge that Mariko was speaking um, to really the highest priority.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. Um, to that point, one of the issues that seems to me incredibly important wasn't mentioned too much, but the wildfire management function of the Forest Service. Apparently, I mean, there's a proposal that it would be separated out from Forest Service and be moved into the Department of Interior. That seems to me, as I wrote in the comment there in the chat, seems to me unscientific in the sense that you're separating then firefighting, the function of firefighting, from other kinds of forest management, including prescribed burns, which are a way of fighting fire, and as well as creating other kinds of habitat. So it seems to me very strange, it's like artificial to separate those out, and yet that's been one of the proposals. What any three of you, if you have any comment on that, how does that look from your perspective?
I believe I can say this reasonably well. Um, there are some things like if you want to throw a monkey wrench into a perfectly fine operating system, try moving the deck chairs on the Titanic. Um, that'll get you plenty of chaos and confusion. Um, there are there are always things that can be worked on better in terms of infrastructure and organization, but the existing organization with fire works. Does it work absolutely perfectly? No, but is it far better than far less? Yes. And so give me a reason why you would want to upend everything and do something totally different without any real conversations with the potential users, the potential people involved, the agent, the organizations, the dismantlement, combined with last year's reductions in forces through the Doge efforts. There's a tremendous amount of institutional knowledge that walked away because they couldn't stay anymore. So, it's a hard question to answer in some respects, but bottom line, what Joe was saying a few minutes ago about it appears to be a dissembling of an institution. There's lots of things pointing to that being a reasonable statement. The thing that's really, really important, if you look at a map of forested land across the United States, and it's a map that FIA and produced, and it's in the Forest Service archives. The bulk of the forested lands east of the Mississippi, like Joe was saying, is privately owned. Pushing all Forest Service operations to Salt Lake City totally ignores the needs and values of private forest land east of the Mississippi. Granted, Forest Service, National Forest System lands in the east occupy a far smaller percentage of a state's land base than the western states. But by no means does that mean that's any less important, and probably is far more important given the population base east of the Mississippi. So, who knows? But that's what I can tell you.
Thank you, Mariko. Sort of to close before we move to Susan Richmond to tell us a little bit about what. Susan, do you have a question, comment?
Yeah, Doug Bechtel of Audubon had asked, if Bartlett is shut down, how will the long-term data be archived and made available to partners and the public?
That's a good question. Here's what we've been seeing. People talk about doing things like closing experimental forests, and Bartlett was on that list. Immediately after the release of that list, comments were coming out. Oh, no, we're not curtailing the research. We're just closing facilities. Well, as Dave pointed out, and I've pointed out many times, Bartlett is a research location that's not adjacent to a university. It's not adjacent to a population center. It's a remote location. To be able to get people to work in the summertime in those locations requires having some way of housing them and some way of being able to do the lab work that you need to do after you come back from the field on a daily basis. So those kinds of statements that have been made by Forest Service and USDA leadership really doesn't capture the reality of the situation. And so who knows? The data from the long-term forest inventory plots is in the archives to date. How the other stuff is going to continue to flow, I have no idea, because they do not have any staffing dedicated to experimental forest tending at the present time. And that's part of the problem. I don't know what they're going to do. That's a very, very good question.
Lots of huge question marks. Any other questions in the chat? Susan, do you see anything there?
No, anyone want to raise their hand?
Anyone want to raise their hand? I have a last question, and I'm going to be devil's advocate here for a second. So, like any other federal agency, the Forest Service has been criticized, right, for various reasons, some of them perfectly good reasons. Lack of coordination sometimes, inefficiencies, so forth. Do you guys feel like this is this proposed reorganization might improve on any of those aspects, or not? We don't want to be be too cut and dried about this. Are there potential upsides here?
No, I think a major reason is this isn't to improve the agency. This isn't a move to improve the agency. They did it with BLM, and like something like a sixth of the staff moved, the rest all the time. And so this is really the idea, is to get rid of the agency. If it were like a holistic, detailed critique in good faith by qualified people, sure. Yeah, as Mariko pointed out earlier, any agency or entity can, there are potential improvements to happen, but this isn't intended for that.
Nobody's asked the field what makes sense. And there's your indicator of how important the local participating employee base has in that decision.
Right, Mar, you shared at the top, I think, some of the words the administration has used to, say what they believe are the benefits, and I don't think any of them actually are borne out. I think it started with, oh, we're moving decision making closer to the ground. It's hard to imagine how decision making could be closer to the ground than what Mariko and David described to me, right? Like, how could it be closer to the ground than that? So that's one example, I think, where the words are just not borne out. Centralizing research and moving it to Colorado, getting rid of these long-term data sets is not going to do that. And similarly, I think what really gets me is the treatment of the people behind. Yes, you can always improve an agency, you can reorganize things. But to get rid of, any institution's biggest asset is almost always its people. So that's one reason I have zero faith that there is actual intent behind the words, because if it were there, I don't think we would be seeing the treatment of Forest Service employees that we've seen, and we would not be seeing zero budgets. Like, that's the other part. Fixing something. Usually, when you're trying to fix something, you may actually have to spend a little bit more money on it. So to say we're trying to fix and improve something and saying we are going to zero the research budget, zero the state and private forestry budget, cut by 40% hazardous fuels reduction, which is what prevents wildfire, it doesn't add up.
It's the wholesale zeroing out of the entire institution's R&D budget and the entire institution's state, private, and tribal budget. The presidential budget figure was zero. It's going to be up to Congress to figure out whether they approve of that or want to restore a level of functioning budget to those branches. But zero is zero, and zero means bye.
Yes. And I think with that we can we can close for the evening. I want to say, dear audience members, Mariko ended with a slide that lists a number of contacts. We need to put pressure on our leaders in the political community to not allow this to happen. And we need to do that quickly because decisions are being made extremely rapidly. Some of them may not be easy to walk back. So if we will put up all the slides on our website and also the recording as soon as it's ready. And we would love it if people could go to some or all of those contacts and weigh in on this because the public needs to be aware. We're all about environmental democracy here, so let's get some democratic action going on this very important topic, and we'll all be extremely grateful, as we are to our three guest speakers tonight, Mariko Yamasaki, Joe Short, and David King. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience. And now I'm going to turn it over to Susan Richmond, my colleague, who is going to tell us about what's coming up next. Susan.
Okay. Oops. So
Go for it.
I just lost what I had here. I am very sorry. Let me get it back up again. While I am, though, we had a question about where are we, who are we, and you're going to see that on the first slide, how to get hold of us.
Do you
And
need me to share the slide?
I've got
Oh,
it, but
you got it. You got it. Yep.
want to read that first slide while I cough?
We are the New Hampshire Network for Environment, Energy, and Climate. And among other services to our members, we produce weekly updates in which we give as much of the news as we are aware of ourselves. We transmit upcoming meetings. We invite members to our meetings and events, and we give notes on recent past meetings, so people can kind of keep up with what we're doing and make their contribution as well, because this is all about volunteer involvement and participation.
Absolutely. So, thanks, Reinmar. So there's the address at the bottom that'll get you on the website, and from there you'll also see information about how to join us if you want to be on the email list and know what's happening. We're taking it quiet this summer, but we do have a bit planned. There's a climate meeting happening on Wednesday, July 1st, and then August 5th, climate working group. And then we have plastics and energy working groups that resume in September. So all of our groups are really democratic, that people are suggesting things that can be done in communities, as well as how to talk to your own representatives, and especially now, how to vet people who plan to vote. So hopefully we just have useful information to you all the time. And Saturday, September 19th, we will be meeting in person once again at Star King in Plymouth for our environmental summit. We'll be sending out information on that, but that's always really reinvigorating to finally get to meet each other and hear about all the wonderful work that everyone's doing. And this is our legislative spreadsheet. That is where you can go to find out what is going on in Concord when the session is on. And we have recommendations that we mostly get from other groups that advise us on their areas of expertise, lakes, energy. And we are trying hard to diminish the amount of plastic in New Hampshire. So you can go to bit.ly/no plastic bags and sign on that petition. And that's about it. But thanks for being here tonight. Thank you so much to our panelists for your passion and wisdom and heart and knowledge. And thanks everyone else for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Mariko. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, David. And we will be following your work. So hope it continues.
Thank you,
Thank you
Ryan.
to the audience.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.